So today we're going to have a look at some RPGs that are releasing in 2024 and beyond. And I've tried to focus on maybe obscure games that some people might not be aware of, or announcements that have perhaps slipped through the cracks, not just super obvious ones like a Dragon's Dogma 2 that I think most people would be aware of in the space. I also think if you are someone who has enjoyed, say, The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk, now Baldur's Gate 3, for your future RPG enjoyment, it's probably more so going to come from indie games rather than the mainstream. A lot of the big mainstream RPG devs these days, many of them are past their prime. We've just been seeing it in action. For instance, Bethesda, they seem to have lost it. BioWare, they're a joke these days. There's others I'm probably forgetting, but in terms of the mainstream devs that are doing well, say Larian, we're probably not going to see a big game from them in potentially 5 years. I'm going to be in my mid-30s, that's pretty scary. But then also CD Projekt Red, they've just wrapped up Cyberpunk. It's going to be years till we get The Witcher 4 and anything else. So you probably do need to expand your horizons a little bit if you're someone who is used to just those mainstream releases. But hopefully you see some stuff that may interest you today. So for instance, the Thaumaturge, which we'll start with, this is developed by a studio that actually made Seven, which is an isometric stealth game. It came out about 6 years ago now. And I mention that because it's always good to know that the developer of an RPG, an indie game, has that experience. They've shipped a product before, because there are so many games that get announced by small teams that just never really happen. They fall apart. A lot of these devs, they might only work on the games part-time, and it can be difficult to keep that motivation up if you've got your full-time career, for instance. So these devs, they've shipped a game before, a pretty decent game, and now they're developing the Thaumaturge, which is a story-driven RPG in quite an interesting setting, 20th century Warsaw. It's certainly got that 1920s kind of vibe if we look at some screenshots, and I guess if we pick a mainstream example, maybe there's a bit of Bloodborne in there as well. If we look at some gameplay in a second, there are monsters and things like that, demons it looks like. The combat is turn-based, which is always nice to see, and if we chuck on this gameplay video just super quickly to give you an idea of what it looks like. We'll try and get to some gameplay. It is a little bit cinematic from what I've seen in the trailers, but it's certainly old school. I like the presentation. It definitely looks nice from a small team, given again it is an indie title. We can see it's isometric, and they mention many times that it is story focused, so there is likely to be a lot of dialogue. Maybe there is some Disco Elysium influence in there, given that did very well for a similarly story-based RPG. And if we go down just a little bit, they describe it in a little bit more detail, so we can see an example of where there's one of those monsters, which is kind of that Bloodborne influence I mentioned earlier. If we look at the features, shape your story as a full-fledged RPG. It allows you to alternate your choices and make you deal with the aftermath. Develop your character, creating your own version of the Thaumaturge. It'll allow you to approach situations in different ways. An important piece here, experience unique turn-based combat, and I've seen it described as maybe being a little bit like a Pokemon or a JRPG sort of combat system. It looks decent, given you've got that plus the presentation and the story focus. It seems to be a pretty well-rounded game. It's also made in Unreal Engine 5. A lot of these isometric indie RPGs, they don't always look great from a graphics perspective. I'd say it's different with this one, which is probably a good thing. It means there might be more eyeballs on it. I'd like to see this do well. I personally don't care that much about graphics, but presentation is important for many. So I hope this does well, and it is releasing in February. So it's very close. It's coming very soon. I hope it does well. I hope it's a good game. I want to talk now about a title that we got a fair bit of information on a couple of days ago. This is Dawnwalker Origins. It's being made by Rebel Wolves, who are a studio formed by former CD Projekt Red developers. And there's some concept art for it, but also details on the game we're going to be getting. So it is a story-driven RPG set in a brand new dark universe. Unreal Engine 5 once again. It feels like almost every 3D game is going to be Unreal Engine 5, which is a little bit scary. Tim, Epic, them having a monopoly. Hopefully that isn't the case long term. Offline single player, you'd assume that's the case, but always nice to see. They do mention that the goal is to revolutionize the RPG genre. I do think that's maybe a little bit too ambitious. That sounds like a marketing buzzword, and this was more of a leak rather than something they formally announced. But my advice would be just make a competent, good role-playing game. We don't need you to totally turn the genre on its head. Even Baldur's Gate 3, for all the praise it gets, I don't think it necessarily changes the whole RPG genre. It was just a very good CRPG that was mainstream, and it happened to do things really well. I think that's all gamers really want. They don't want you to add a bunch of gimmicks in there to try and be super innovative necessarily. If you do that and you've got a good idea, then great. I've certainly seen that go wrong before, and given many members of this team likely worked on Cyberpunk, they've surely seen that themselves, where they promised something that was, it was going to change the face of gaming, and it really didn't. It probably just let people down when it came out. They promised more than they actually did deliver, even though I do like Cyberpunk, and certainly now it's obviously pretty well polished, but hopefully it can be something promising. They mention there's no microtransactions. It's entering the alpha stage. There's 100 people working on the game. I think that's a good number of people for a game like this. You don't want a studio with thousands of employees, because then nothing can really be done, because devs try and be creative, but they have to go through 10 different meetings, 20 different approvals from managers. That's where everything starts to feel a bit too corporate and bloated. So 100 people, that's a good number. It means it'll still be likely a big game, but hopefully they can still be quite creative too. It does mention that NetEase became a shareholder in Rebel Wolves, the studio, recently, but they do remain creatively independent. And that last bit's good, because NetEase are a scummy organization. I believe they're involved in a lot of pay-to-win games, certainly in Asia and beyond, and hopefully they just stay away. Hopefully this can just be that single-player RPG. Hopefully it has that integrity. There is a bit of concept art. You can see a city here. Not really sure what this is. It looks like the start of a battle. There's some monsters, some enemies. Now, I don't really care that much about concept art these days, because we've had so many games where they're overhyped, they're overpromised, and what you end up getting is a fraction of maybe the excitement that you had. So for me, they just need to silently work on the game until they have something really substantial to show. Genuine gameplay, not just some sort of cinematic trailer. Something that really shows us that they've got the right mindset, that they want to make a quality RPG for the players, and that is their primary motivation. And we can also see I believe the devs made a cryptic post where they took a photo of their kitchen, but you can see in the background there that there is some sort of sprawling, grassy world there with the mountains and the trees, and I believe that is going to be part of the game world. But again, this is just a photo, it's just concept art essentially. We need to see it in action. It's probably going to be a while down the track, I imagine years till we see anything, but it's nice to see that maybe some of the people who've worked with CD Projekt Red in the past, perhaps on Witcher 3, even if they've left, they're not just being taken up by maybe live service studios. They're going into developer roles that maybe aren't great for the industry. They are working for other teams that want to make RPGs, so that's a good thing. Hopefully this works out. We've got this game as well, Peripatire, I believe it's called, and it's actually inspired not just by CRPGs, but by immersive sim devs like Looking Glass Studios and Iron Storm, so responsible for Deus Ex, System Shock 2, the Thief series, those older titles, which are really, really nice games. So seeing more of that would be great, given the modern Deus Ex series, for instance. We haven't seen anything in it in a long time. If we look at some screenshots here, we can see that sort of cyberpunky kind of influence. And if we chuck on one of the trailers here, it definitely looks interesting. It's been in development for quite some time. I've seen posts about it from sort of 4 or 5 years ago now. There is a playable demo, and the gunplay is quite nice. It's lacking a bit in content, and some of the feedback I've read suggests it's, at the very best, it's in sort of an alpha state. So I don't think it's going to come out next year. It's probably a little while away, and again, this is a very indie team. It may even only be one person who's actually working on this title, so it's something to maybe be excited about given that influence, that Deus Ex kind of influence. We don't see a lot of influence from a series like that these days, but if it can work out, I hope it does, because I love these sort of titles. This one is Zoria Age of Shattering, and it's due to come out in March of next year, so pretty close. The devs recently announced that all the content is ready, they just want to do some polishing before they actually get it into our hands. So that is always good to see, that they're not just rushing to the finish line. They are trying to take a little bit of time on the quality control side. There is a demo for it if you're interested, but it's a squad-based tactical RPG, turn-based combat, follower management. It certainly has, I would say, some Divinity Original Sin influence, and it was probably developed around the time, or started development around the time those Original Sin games came out. So that does make sense. It's a team of 3. It's certainly not a big indie dev team, but they seem to be doing the right things. The trailer itself, the presentation looks serviceable, and just looking through it, basically everything is done reasonably well. There's nothing that sticks out to me as being bad. You've obviously got that turn-based combat. You've got the UI, for instance, some mechanics like alchemy, cooking. You can see here your UI for your inventory. It all looks fine. I just wonder if there's anything that makes it genuinely stand out. And I will say, from my perspective, I don't really care about it innovating or having some sort of hook. If it's a good CRPG, I'll probably play it. If it's like a Baldur's Gate, a Divinity Original Sin, that's a good thing. But just for the wider market, there probably needs to be something to pull people in, especially if it is an indie title, so it gets some eyes on it. But hopefully it does reasonably well. Squad-based tactical RPGs, we can always use more of them, so hopefully it delivers. And we've got something a little bit different here that was totally unexpected. I couldn't believe when I saw it, but this is actually related to Ubisoft, and I feel like I'm in Bizarro world now. Old school RPGs, Ubisoft, them in the same sentence. It doesn't feel right. But Ubisoft actually did produce a game called Might and Magic 10 a few years ago that was a pretty good old school RPG. I'm not sure how well it sold. I assume they weren't doing anything like that again because they focused on Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, anything that's generic, they seem to be enthusiastic about. But the Might and Magic series as a whole, it's got a lot of history behind it. If you're not familiar with them, the way that they play, it's kind of like, say, a Baldur's Gate 3, but it's different in that it's set in first person. You play in the first person, you go around the world like you might do a Skyrim or an Oblivion or something, but when you get into battle, they are encounters similar to Baldur's Gate 3 in that they're turn-based. You can often move around the world as well. You're not always just static, depending on which game in the series that you play. But that's how they kind of are. If you see screenshots, videos, but you've never played one, it may take a little bit just to realize how they actually play. It's not always super clear. But what we do have here is Might and Magic Fates. Supposedly it's a new AAA game in the Might and Magic series produced by Ubisoft Shanghai, and they were hiring for new developers for this title, as well as apparently registering websites for Might and Magic Fates. So it does seem to be real. In this tweet which leaks it, they talk about looking for experienced open world designers. Now, for being pessimistic here, it could be that for whatever reason, Ubisoft just want to use the Might and Magic name to create yet another generic open world sandbox like all their other titles. That would be a little bit odd to me because I can't think of anyone who would know what Might and Magic is and yet would be excited for just your typical Ubisoft game. That would be quite odd. However, there are a lot of people familiar with Heroes of Might and Magic, which is more of a strategy series. It's actually separate from the Might and Magic single-player role-playing games. They're two different series. So maybe because Heroes of Might and Magic is so popular, that's why they're dragging up this name again. I hope it's not the case, given they actually made an RPG 10 years ago or so, Might and Magic 10. Maybe they'll do somewhat right by it and try and make a genuine RPG again. But in the current climate, given how expensive games are and how risk-averse Ubisoft seem to be, I think they talked about how almost every everything going forward is going to be like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry. They're pulling back from any risk-taking. I think they've talked about that in the past. It just doesn't seem likely that they're actually going to be creating a genuine AAA Might and Magic game. It's an RPG, CRPG. I can't see that, but this leak looks genuine. We'll see what happens with it. And lastly, we do have Skeld against the Black Priory. It's clearly quite an old school influence role-playing game. It's probably going to come out around sort of June 2024, around 6 months' time. If we look at the visuals, they are somewhat reminiscent of, say, Ultima, which is a very old school series if you're aware of it. But even if you aren't, some of it somewhat reminds me of Legacy of Kain, some of those earlier titles. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but you might know them, so it's something to compare it with. If we look at some of the visuals, they actually look really nice for something that is going for that MS-DOS kind of vibe. The character portraits are pretty nice. This old witch, it looks like, quite a memorable visual. It's described as a party-based RPG set in a grim, dark fantasy world of tragic heroes, violent deaths, and Lovecraftian horror. Choices matter, there's a branching story, and it does have crunchy, tactical, turn-based combat and character customization, but hopefully it's another good one. It might be a little bit too old school for some people, but a nice indie game nonetheless. Hopefully it is a success, but I just wanted to get some eyeballs on some lesser-known RPGs, and maybe some to get excited about in the future. Especially given we have had some letdowns lately, like Bloodlines 2. We know that's going to be a disaster. I'm sure there'll be many flops in 2024, but hopefully they are complemented by some good games that we can get pumped about. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.